One of the fascinating aspects about Calvin's life that he puts at the beginning of his Psalms commentary in 1557 is the brief but yet moving account he has of his conversion. He speaks about the light and the gospel and of a warmth and of coming to a state of teachableness, an openness to the Word of God, an openness to a transforming. And I think that that's a key to looking at Calvin's life. Calvin is a man who was constantly going forward, in his eyes striving to the imitation of Christ, driving himself day and night in the service of the Lord, revising his great work, the Institutes of the Christian Religion, ever seeking to improve it, preaching many times a week. His whole life is given to the service of the Lord, but also a view that in this world we grow in sanctification. That is a journey. And that, I think, is key to understand not only John Calvin, but the whole movement that would take his name. A sense of journey, a sense of promise, a sense of covenant between God and God's people. So the young Calvin arrives in the city of Basel, saying in his account that he hoped that he would just become another one of the humanists aspiring to a kind of literary fame, probably inspired by Erasmus, who died in the city in 1536. There's no evidence that they actually met. But Calvin says the truth found him out. And he's devoted himself to the study of Protestant writers and wrote an extraordinary work. His first publication had been a commentary on the great Roman philosopher Seneca. But now Calvin wrote something very, very different. He wrote a little work in Latin called the Institutes of the Christian Religion. This initial work by an unknown author was a sensation and made him a name to be reckoned with. Over the years, Calvin, as I mentioned, would revise the text. He would produce it in French as well as in Latin. It would change form, but its arguments would not fundamentally be altered, but rather they were augmented as Calvin both grew in his own learning and his arguments, but also they map the changing events of his life, the debates with which he was involved, the arguments. The Institutes is a kind of map of Calvin's life from their first appearance in 1536 through to his death. And taking form in the last Latin edition of 1559, where Calvin has those words which are so evocative of his thought. Book 1, Chapter 1 of his 1559 Institutes. Nearly all of the wisdom we possess, that is to say, true and sound wisdom, consists of two parts: the knowledge of God and of ourselves. But while joined by many bonds, which one precedes and brings forth the other, is not easy to discern. In the first place, no one can look upon himself without immediately turning his thoughts to the contemplation of God, in whom he lives and moves. For quite clearly, the mighty gifts with which we are endowed are hardly from ourselves, but indeed our very being is nothing but subsistence in the one God. From the start of his first great work, followed by his commentary on Paul's letter to the Romans, Calvin revealed himself to be an extraordinary theological mind. a view of God as magisterial, but of a God in relationship to humanity, as those opening words suggest. Calvin was not interested in a speculative interpretation of the divine, but of the God who reaches out to humanity, who saves. From his time in Basel, Calvin found himself returning to his native land on various business, and on the way home, stopping in the city of Geneva, encounters, and he has this extraordinary relating of this in his life, encounters the man who would become his close friend, Guillaume Farel, who looms up over him and says, "You must stay." So Calvin, who has no training, he's not ordained, and no particular training for the job, stays in Geneva with Farel. And it's a very rough time. The city has only recently been won over to the Reformation, and the divisions are such that Calvin finds himself in over his head, and his attempt to act with Farel leads to their expulsion in 1538. To make a complicated rather short, Calvin ends up in Strasbourg, where another mentor figure emerges, Martin Bucer, man whom Calvin loved. Bucer teaches Calvin by putting him in a congregation to become a pastor. Calvin learns how to take worship, he learns how to preach, he learns what the church is in this world, and he continues to write. He becomes a significant figure on the wider Protestant stage, meeting men such as Philip Melanchthon and others, and even hoping to meet Martin Luther. That opportunity never happens. Calvin had an extraordinary high view of Luther, whom he regarded as the great apostle of the Reformation, although ultimately he would depart from his views in significant ways. But for Calvin, this was a new world that he had entered into, and he was emerging as a reformer, as a leading figure. Now, it might be interesting to note in this, Calvin was a Frenchman. Of course, he spoke fluent Latin, an educated man. But he was spending much of his time in German-speaking lands, and in his letters he often refers to the fact that people will speak German. He has no idea what they're talking about. And he says that Bucer would talk in German to the others when he didn't want Calvin to hear what he was saying. So he's living in another world culturally. And that's where he's emerging as a reformer. And in 1541, he's invited to return to the chaos that is Geneva, and there he will remain until his death in 1564, apart from some travels that he makes. When Calvin returns to Geneva in 1541, he immediately draws up what are known as the ecclesiastical ordinances. He now has a clear sense of what the church should look like. Calvin, the lawyer by training, becomes the man who can build a church. But he's also now theologically more sophisticated. He's completely part of this network of reformers that extends through Zwingli's successor, Heinrich Bullinger, through Wittenberg, and Strasbourg, where Martin Bucer were. He's not a stand-alone figure, but is part of this whole generation of reformers that have emerged in the period following the 1520s. In Geneva, Calvin preached and wrote extensively. And it's very hard to give, in a few moments, a sense of how extraordinarily engaged he was. But perhaps when one sees here in this map how relatively small the city was, right on the edge of the French lands in Savoy, Geneva was transformed by the influx of religious refugees from the French lands. These French people coming into the city became Calvin's principal supporters because Calvin's own relationship with the Genevans was tense. He was an outsider, and they didn't particularly take to his form of discipline for the church because Calvin believed that the church had to be governed by a strict discipline. This is where you get his reputation for being a tyrant. And he served as the chair of what became known as the consistory, which watched over the moral lives of the people. And their cases were brought to the consistory where Calvin would preside over them. So he was very much a public figure, very much involved in the life of the community, also preaching several times a week. This form of activity made Calvin an extremely divisive figure. Many of the Genevans didn't like him. There's the story that someone named their dog Calvin. But the French refugees coming into the city who swelled it really to almost to the breaking point. No other city in Europe at the time had as many refugees per capita as Geneva. These people came largely because of Calvin, this Frenchman who was there, and they became his basis of support. So within the city there was considerable tumult, and those who were in power were often quite hostile to Calvin, although they recognized his preeminence. So Geneva was a place of great contention here during much of Calvin's life, through the 1540s and into the 1550s. During this time also, Calvin's reputation as an international figure also grew, because some of the refugees who came to Geneva came from lands far beyond, such as England, the German lands, the Low Countries. John Knox famously spent time in Geneva and would return to his native Scotland, declaring that Geneva was the perfect school of Christ. The influence of Geneva grew and grew as people were drawn to Calvin and drawn to his community, and then would return back to their own lands. So I want to just stress that this is an extremely unstable place. And it is in the midst of that, all that conflict, that the incident for which Calvin perhaps is best remembered took place. A Spaniard, Michael Servetus, with whom Calvin had had contact over quite a number of years, arrived in the city in August 1553, claiming that he was on his way to Italy. He was apprehended because he was a known heretic. He had been arrested in France. He held views that denied the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. He also denied infant baptism and a range of other doctrinal points held essential by Calvin and others. Servetus was tried during the fall of 1553. The council was determined that he should be convicted and executed. They took Calvin, with whom they did not have a particularly good relationship, and asked him to do the theological investigation. The confrontation between Calvin and Servetus during those weeks in 1553 is astonishing and fascinating. Two completely different views of the church, of Reformation, and of the Christian life. Servetus was held in terrible conditions in prison, and Calvin's hostility towards him comes out at every moment. The two men hated each other. In the end, Servetus, once the other Swiss churches had been consulted, Servetus was burnt at the stake. That's not disputed at all. We know that's what took place. The question is, what was Calvin's role in this? He certainly had written the recommendation that Servetus was a heretic, but he himself had no power to declare that someone should be executed. Servetus was put to death and immediately became, for many people, a martyr to intolerance. Calvin became the butcher of Geneva, a man who it was reputed had laughed as Servetus had been put into the flames, a story which is almost certainly apocryphal. But Calvin is remembered to this day for his involvement or supposed involvement in this story. And it has shaped his reputation during the 16th century, together with his most prominent, or at least what is taken to be his most prominent teaching, and that is on divine election or predestination. Calvin taught that there is a form of double predestination. The moment of creation, it was elected who would be saved and who would be damned. Now, this differed from other views, such as those held by Zwingli, who spoke about election of those who would be saved, but did not draw the other side of the equation. Calvin was and believed he was taking this from the tradition of Augustine and Aquinas and primarily from Paul, that there is an explicit, that the two forms of election are clearly there. It's found articulated in the Institutes. It's found in other of his major works. There is no doubt about it. But what his opponents said is that you cannot possibly hold this argument without drawing or leading to the inevitable conclusion that God is the author of evil. And that became one of the dominant themes of Calvin's engagement with his opponents. Calvin roundly denied that that was what he was saying. But the combination of the intolerant Calvin of Servetus's execution and the teaching of double predestination has very much colored his legacy. And that legacy, I think, needs to be revised. Calvin was a brilliant writer who could express as few others the beauty of God's relationship with humanity. And above all, I think, the beauty of the human life in Christ. In Book 3 of his Institutes, he writes on the Christian life in a way that demonstrates his extraordinary ability to offer pastoral encouragement to the journey that all people are on in this world. I quote, "But no one in this earthly prison of the body has sufficient strength to press on with due eagerness, and weakness so weighs down the great number that, with wavering and limping and even creeping along the ground, they move at a feeble rate. Let each one of us, then, proceed according to the measure of his puny capacity, and set out upon the journey we have begun. No way, though, will it be slight. Therefore, let us not cease so to act that we may make some unceasing progress in the way of the Lord. And let us not despair at the slightness of our success. For even though attainment may not correspond to desire, when today outstrips yesterday, the effort is not lost." The growth of Calvinism and the popularity of Calvin, whether in England or Scotland, in the Dutch lands, bear witness to a man whose thought was ultimately reassuring and comforting. That the faithful are in a covenantal relationship with a God who never abandons them. That the promises of Christ are sure. And that we can see ourselves in the lives of the peoples of the Old Testament, the Israelites. And just as God was faithful to them, so God will remain with us. Calvin preached that innumerable times from the pulpits in Geneva. The people followed him in great numbers from church to church, where he would be carried in his later years because of his ill health. And that ultimately, I would argue, is the legacy that made Calvinism a movement that transformed the Western Christianity.